America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker with the Job Creators Network, and today we're joined by John Gibbs, who is the director of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. John has been examining one of the most pressing economic challenges facing American families today, the growing difficulty of achieving homeownership and the role that investors, government policy, and mortgage markets play in shaping housing affordability. John, welcome to Main Street Matters.
Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Well, you had a great piece in the Washington Examiner called Making Housing Work for Americans. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it is the American dream for these young families to own a home, to buy a home. I have my daughter's 25. She got married a year ago. They actually did buy a house, but it is, you know, it's tough. It's tough to make those big mortgage payments. I've got another daughter coming up through college. She has aspirations to buy a house, but it's going to be even more expensive for them. So let's kind of start with the big picture. Why has housing affordability become such a major issue for families today?
Well, you know, housing affordability is getting worse and worse over the decades. And one of the ironies is that the more the government has put into it in terms of money and programs, the more expensive it has gotten. And one thing that people don't know is that 80% or so of all mortgages are government-backed in our country. There's nowhere else on earth where the government backs 80% of mortgages. We're the only ones. And what that does is, just like with student loans, when the government backs student loans, it makes college more expensive. And so when the government backs housing loans, it also makes housing more expensive. It increases what people can afford, and so it keeps driving prices up, and it keeps becoming a self-reinforcing cycle. So that's one of the reasons why we have such expensive prices, is that the government is driving demand faster than supply can possibly keep up. Another reason is immigration. You know, we bring in millions and millions and millions of people, and that's what the government has decided to do. But one of the things it has not thought about is, where are they going to live? All the people that come here have got to have a place to live, so that adds a huge amount of demand into the housing market. So those are two of many issues that cause housing to be very expensive. The fact that the government drives it up by giving easier access to credit than would exist in the free market, and the fact that we bring in so many people that all have to have a place to live, and so that increases demand also faster than supply can possibly keep up. And those things compounding year after year after year really drive prices up quite a bit.
I can remember when, under the Biden administration, when there was such a big influx of immigrants coming in, and some of the southern states were actually busing immigrants up into the Northeast, into states like New York and things like that. And I can remember the mayor of New York, Mayor Adams, couldn't house them all in the city for obvious reasons. And so he was offering rent for if they would go up into northern New York and live and work up there, that he was offering for I think it was a year paid rent. Are those the types of policies that then increase demand so much that it also increases the cost of housing as well?
Yeah, that's just part of the picture. I mean, the mayor doing things like that is a big part of the problem. But even the federal government simply deciding that we want millions and millions of people a year to come in at a faster rate than we can house them and assimilate them, that in and of itself is a root cause of the problem before it even gets to the state level, because the states are at the receiving end of having to deal with this. The individual states don't control immigration. The federal government is one that controls that. So the states are having left having to deal with this problem once the government has decided to do it. So that is a big part of the problem. Yes, that we bring in more people than we can possibly house in a reasonable way, so it ends up driving up prices. There's been lots of studies on this that demonstrate this effect. But one of the issues here is that the people that advocate for bringing in so many people into our country are not necessarily the ones who have to pay the price themselves for the impact that it has on housing. And so the cost gets passed down the line to someone else that they don't have to worry about. So you end up creating this problem. So yeah, it's a big issue.
I mentioned my daughter again. Before they bought their first house, they rented for a
Mhm.
year, and they went into a neighborhood that was actually completely owned by a big corporation.
Wow.
And every house in the neighborhood was a rental property. In your piece that you wrote in the Washington Examiner, you argue that homes are increasingly being treated as commodities rather than places for families to live. What
Mhm.
do you mean by that? And what are you seeing in those types of neighborhoods? Because I have my opinion on how that neighborhood was taken care of, I guess,
Sure.
um, is the
Yeah.
nicest way to put it.
Yeah.
Even though they were brand new homes, it was
Right.
not a nice place. But what do you mean by the commodity piece?
Yeah. So, I think that the average American would agree that a home should be a place where you raise your family. But what we have is you have a lot of investors that are going in and buying up homes, and it makes it so that a regular person who's trying to make a bid on a house may be outbid by an investor who's going in for that house, and that's almost not a fair fight. And something important to point out here is many people imagine that it's very large corporations that are going in and buying up all these housing in the different neighborhoods. They are active, but they're only about 1 to 2% actually. The
Hmm.
vast bulk of housing that's bought as investments are bought by mom and pop investors who own between 2 and 10 properties. So you have a very, very large number of mom and pop investors who own, say, 5, 6 properties, and they're the ones going and often bidding and on these properties against families. And one of the things that I've talked about before is we have the mortgage interest deduction, which applies even to investment properties. So if you are getting a mortgage on 3, 4, or 5 investment properties that you own, you can deduct the interest on your taxes. This means that the government is literally subsidizing people owning 4, 5, 6, 10 houses as investment properties. As long as they've got a mortgage on it, they can actually write off the interest on that mortgage. So this is the government actually incentivizing people collecting houses as investments. So this is a huge part of the financialization of housing that I was talking about, is the many government incentives that make it easy for people to simply go and buy up houses. And again, large corporations are doing it, yes, but it's mostly actually mom and pops who own 2, 5, 7, 8, 10 properties. That's the vast majority of investment properties, is people who own a relatively smaller number. But the aggregate cumulative effect of that is huge, to your point. You end up getting a lot of housing that would have otherwise been available to families, which is now being bought by investors that they can in turn rent out. And if they don't want to keep up the maintenance on it, again, to your point, then they can simply skimp a little bit on that with the idea that people may not have another choice to go anywhere else nearby. So they think they might be able to get away with that. So that is another one of the issues that you sometimes face with this stuff.
So this financialization of the housing market, I haven't heard it termed like that. It's a very interesting way to look at it. In terms of the subsidizing through the tax code, essentially, and allowing homeowners, the mom and pop or the big corporations, to take these mortgage interest deductions. I'm sort of going to flip the coin. Like, what would happen if those tax deductions went away? Because there's still a fair amount of people who, even if those policies went away, if those rental homes weren't available, where do you see those families' options in terms of still buying a home, particularly with housing prices at levels that they're at right now?
Sure, that's actually a very good question. I tried to model this and run some numbers on this. What we seem to see is that if you were to take away, for example, the interest deduction for investment properties, you would reduce the incentive for investors to buy these properties to rent out. So there would be fewer of them doing it. What that means is that more of those properties will be available to home buyers, first time home buyers, and families and individuals. So, because you'd have more housing available to families and individuals, that would reduce the upward pressure on prices because it increases the supply for individuals and families. So, you're going to get some good news there in that you'll have a little bit of price relief in that sense. Another follow-on is that because more people would be able to buy houses, there will be fewer of them renting. And so that would take a little bit of pressure off the rental market as well. And so you would actually see some relief on the rental market and the home buying market as well. If you make more of this housing available to families and individuals, which would happen because the investors, when that incentive is gone of the interest reduction, they're going to pull back a little bit and they're going to put their money somewhere else, perhaps stocks or whatever it might be, leaving that housing that they would have bought available for regular people to buy.
It's hard for me to wrap my head around taking away investment incentives, and understanding how that benefits the economy, because I'm always advocating for policies that incentivize investment.
Sure.
Um, and but I can see the argument there in terms of how it's driving up costs, because these investors, whether it's individuals buying one and two homes or big corporations buying whole neighborhoods, buying and building whole neighborhoods, it is competing with these first time buyers who are trying to purchase their first home, through, the first time home buyers program. That's the FHA program. Is that a system that you think is leading to the cost of housing going up, in your analogy to like the student loan, because it's backed by the government? Is that one of the policies that you would like to see change then?
The FHA first time home buyer program, I think, probably has a little bit less of an effect. What does have a really large effect here is the fact that the United States has an entire secondary mortgage market. So that means if you're a mortgage lender and you give out a mortgage to someone, normally you won't have that money back until they pay you back their mortgage. So what happens is that the government says we want to be able to make you lend quickly again soon. And so the government will buy that mortgage off of you, give you that money back, then you can turn around and lend that money again. And when you lend it again, the government will buy that mortgage, give you the money for it, and you turn around and lend again. This lets mortgage lenders lend out loans at a much higher pace than they would be able to do if the government wasn't backing it. And so what that does is it increases demand and it increases the price of homes because it increases demand faster than supply can keep up. And again, it's important to point out this is something that we are unique in. There's no other country on earth where the government runs a secondary mortgage market. We're one of the only ones that does that. So this is something rare and unique, and one of the few ways that we are more socialist, for example, than any European country. So that is something that happens with FHFA. That is a big factor here. What happens further is once they buy those mortgages, they bundle them up and then sell them in what's called mortgage-backed securities. And so investors can buy these mortgage-backed securities, kind of like buying a treasury bond or something. And you buy these securities, and that has an impact on the mortgage rate. So, for example, during COVID, the Federal Reserve bought $1.2 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. That had the impact of driving mortgage rates down to record lows that we saw around 2020, 21. Well, what many people forget is that when mortgage rates go down, house prices go up because it makes it so that more people can jump in with those lower monthly payments, and they do jump in, and that causes more of a frenzy, and that causes the prices to go up. So one of the reasons we saw house prices double from 2020 to 2024 is because the interest rates went so low that it caused so many people to jump in, and that was completely caused by the government through the Federal Reserve buying up all those mortgage-backed securities. So the secondary mortgage market and the mortgage-backed securities system that we have actually is a factor that causes unaffordability. And it causes large spikes and drops and without a lot of stability. So it is something we're going to have to sit down and take a good look at some point.
Yeah, I read, I think it may be either 2018 or maybe 2020, that the average cost of a home was about $200,000. So sounds almost cheap now, right?
Yeah,
Um, and that now the average cost of a home is over $400,000. I mean,
right,
so that's first time home buyers, in their 20s staring at a
right.
$400,000 mortgage. I mean, and if they're not putting a substantial amount of money as a down payment and they're doing those 2 or 3% down mortgages, that's a $4,000 a month mortgage payment. It's an impossible thought that you could even buy a house. What are your thoughts on what's happening now? And I know real estate is kind of localized, but I'm in Florida, in Central Florida, and I'm seeing a slowdown in the housing market. And some of it is from the mortgage rates being, we'll call them high, but 6%, it's just not 3%.
Right.
But
Yep.
so higher than they were during COVID.
Mm.
Um, but I'm seeing houses sit longer. I'm seeing people be able to negotiate prices. I'm seeing prices come down on homes in my neighborhood, people having to come down $100,000 to sell their house. I mean, that's no small amount of money that people are coming down. It's not 10,000, it's $100,000. Are you seeing that in other areas, or is it isolated to just areas, local areas?
We're actually seeing this in many areas. We're seeing homes stay on the market for longer. We're seeing more price cuts. So we're definitely seeing this effect. And I think you brought up a very good point that the mortgage rates being higher than they were, let's say, in the early 80s, you were looking at 15% mortgage interest rates. But for now, it's about 6 to 7%. But that's higher than what people have been used to over recent years. And so when interest rates go up, prices go down. And so we're seeing that effect of high interest rates. People are looking at that and they're looking at their monthly payment and what that's going to be under those higher interest rates. And they're saying, no, we can't do this. And so what we're seeing is that the home sellers are having to reduce their prices or keep their home on the market for longer or just simply pull it off the market. A lot of people are saying, I can't get the price I want, so I'm going to take it off the market. So yes, we are seeing this phenomenon happen. And, this goes in cycles up and down. When interest rates go up, prices go down. When interest rates go down a lot, prices go up. And, you see natural up and down cycles in almost any product that's on the market, including housing. But this is what we're seeing right now. The difference, of course, is, as I said earlier, our housing market is far more socialist, if you will, than most other
Mhm.
types of industries. And so the government's got its hand in it quite a bit. And sometimes the government wants to drive things so hard that it ends up causing overheating, as we saw in the 2008 financial crisis. And so we do get those issues happening. But now we are seeing a period of cooling off a little bit. There are people calling for decreases in interest rate right now because they want things to go up again. But there's this whole issue of, do we want to let the markets operate on its own, or do you want the government always having its hand in the cookie jar trying to drive things up and up and up forever? And so this is something that I think we really need to have more of a conversation on, unless we want, with all the young people that have to pay $1 million for a starter house, which is where we're headed right now. After a very short amount of time, we're going to be there quicker than we think. We really have got to step back and rethink, I think, at a big level, the way this whole thing works.
Yeah, I mean, we used to all look at California as that's where you paid a lot of money for, your first house or a starter home or a home that, needed a lot of work. You still had to pay 800, 900, maybe $1 million for that house and then put another $200,000 into it.
Right,
And it
absolutely.
feels like there are parts of the country that are starting to catch up to that. And
Yep.
so I say this as a homeowner, but I'd like to see things normalize
Right.
for my daughter and for other kids like her who have an aspiration to buy their first home when they get married.
Mm.
They're saving now, but I don't think they could save fast enough to have enough money for it. So I also feel like um, during COVID, it was so insane, again, localized in my area, the bidding wars that were happening where I live.
Mm.
They wrote up in newspapers because it
Wow.
was insane. There would be 10 or 20 offers, most of
Wow.
them at asking price or above. People were paying $50,000 over appraisal,
Wow.
as much as 50,000 over appraisal. They were giving gifts with their offers. One of them was they wrote about this one
Wow.
couple who got cruise tickets with their
Wow.
offer. Cruise tickets, $50,000 over, and the bank said, "Sure, if you want to pay 50 grand more, we're only financing up to this." So they would pay $50,000 out of their pocket
Wow.
above appraisal to get the house. And
Mhm.
those people are sitting in those houses now, and they're not able to sell them because they can't get what they paid for them now. So,
Right.
I see that. So I see this slowdown, and just to be able to negotiate on a house, I think is a step in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you've really nailed it. And I think you actually just now brought up a very, very important point. Sometimes when I bring up the things that I talk about, such as, backing, having a plan to back the government out of so much control of the housing market, people will say, oh, so you want to crash housing prices? Is that what you want to do? And what I would say is, no, you don't want to crash it. But instead of having prices double every 4 years, maybe it goes up by 20, 30% every 4 years instead of doubling every 4 years. And when you ask the average person like yourself, I'm so glad you shared, people are willing to accept that. They're willing to say, I'm a homeowner, but I'm okay if my price doesn't double every 4 years if it means that the next generation is able to afford something. The average person is okay with that. We're not talking about crashing or declining. We're talking about still going up, but not doubling, maybe going up like this. So people are okay with this. And I think that the average American understands the issues going on here. But again, you just got this system that has so much momentum behind it in terms of the way it operates that it's difficult for the politicians to step up and try to look at it. The Trump administration has talked about housing and finance reform. That's where a lot of this stuff lands. And what do you do with Fannie and Freddie? Those are the ones who buy the mortgages and securitize it into mortgage-backed securities. So there's a lot of talk about that, but it is very sensitive because the industry and many people who make a lot of money off this do not necessarily want changes to the system. And we want them to make money, of course, but we also don't want $1 million starter home. And so we
Right.
really, I think, have got to continue to demand that all the policymakers and the stakeholders out there start to take a look at this more seriously.
You've talked about in your piece, rather than banning investor purchases outright, you've discussed the possibility of a grace period where families would get the first opportunity to buy a home. How does that work? Walk us through that.
Yeah, so the proposal from President Trump was to ban or restrict the ability of large institutional investors to buy single family homes for the purposes of renting them out. That was met with a lot of resistance from some of the politicians out there who are connected with the people that are on the other side of this. So I was proposing something that might be more palatable politically, which is instead of having an outright ban, you have a period of time in which those large institutional investors would not be able to go in and buy those. Instead, it has to be open only to individuals and families who would get first dibs to be able to go in and make an offer on that before it would go to those large institutional investors. So you do have to give credit to the president for understanding that the financialization of housing is an issue. That's why he is driving this policy. And so I give him great credit for that. But as I said, only about 1% of all investors are covered by this because most investors are not large and institutional. They're small and mom and pop. So it's not going to have much of an effect. I think stepping back and taking a look at things like what do we do with the mortgage interest deduction for investment properties? I think something like that has a lot more juice to the squeeze of accomplishing this goal. But nonetheless, yes, the compromise I put in there, because some of the politicians might not be, comfortable with going all the way, is to do it as a grace period instead.
One of the more surprising arguments in your op-ed concerns the 30-year mortgage. Why do you believe Americans should rethink how we view long-term mortgages?
Yeah, so the 30-year mortgage is not something that would exist in the free market. It only exists because of the government involvement in mortgages. And there are very few countries on earth that have a 30-year mortgage. We're one of the few ones that does. So this is another way that we're more socialist than most European countries in the fact that we have a government-backed 30-year mortgage. Now, why does this make a difference? Because say that you had a 15-year mortgage instead of a 30-year mortgage. The disadvantage of that is you're going to have higher monthly payments. The advantage of that is over time, you're going to save hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest payments. You're putting so much more wealth back into the hands of American families if you could get more 15-year mortgages because you're saving them. I think I calculated for a $400,000 house, it's a savings of like $300,000. That's money in the pockets of families if they had a 15-year instead of a 30-year. So how do you deal with this problem of higher monthly payments? What that does is it will force builders to build lower cost homes that are higher quality because they're going to know a person can't afford the higher monthly payment of a 15-year mortgage. So we better start making more economical houses that instead of 600 grand, they're 380, so that people can get a decent payment on a 15-year mortgage for it. So in other words, it's something that would force the industry to innovate and economize and increase its productivity. And by the way, labor productivity in home building is extremely low, much lower than other industries, and it hasn't really been increasing. And I believe that part of the reason is because the government involvement gives them a free pass to keep things the way they are now without having to do what your smartphone company does, your computer maker does, your car maker does. They all have to be innovating all the time. They've got to be getting more high tech and lower cost and using innovation. Housing has been spared from that because it has such heavy government involvement. And so I believe if you were to go to more 15-year mortgages, it will provide a natural incentive for those home builders to have to build lower cost homes that are still high quality so that people could afford it on a 15-year mortgage. And then you get the advantage of 300 grand in wealth going back to American families and saved interest payments. I think it would be a huge game changer.
I think most Americans assume that the 30-year mortgage expanded homeownership. What does your research show on that?
Yeah, so I crunched numbers on that, and what we found is that the 30-year mortgage has not expanded home ownership. What it does is it changes when people would buy their house, and it also increases the price of homes. Because with a 30-year mortgage, you can get a more expensive house for the same monthly payment. And so what that does is it lets the builders build more expensive houses because they know that people can afford them due to the 30-year mortgage. So that is the biggest effect we see is an increase in prices because of the expanded credit of a 30-year mortgage. But as far as expanding home ownership, we don't actually see a lot of effects there. We see maybe a change in a few years, plus or minus, when a person would buy a home, but they were already going to buy it anyway. And so the single biggest effect of the 30-year mortgage has been to to increase prices by increasing what people are able to afford with a mortgage.
I think the best analogy of that is probably what we're seeing with car loans.
Yes.
Because car loans used to be 36 or 48 months, then it was 60 months. Now they have 72 months, 84 months. I think they have a 10-year loan on cars now. Who keeps their car 10 years?
Yes. That's a very, very good analogy. The average price of a car now is $52,000. That is just absolutely astronomical. And one of the reasons that they're able to get away with that is because, as you said, the car loan terms are now going up to 72 months and 84 months and levels that you would never have seen even 10, 15 years ago. But you're seeing much longer term loan terms for car loans now. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very similar effect at play here. The more you expand credit like this and you expand what people can buy, the less the industry has an incentive to economize and increase productivity and innovation to offer lower quality products at higher prices.
I think I did see earlier in Trump's term, he was considering a expanding the 30-year mortgage. Is that still something that's floating out there? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I believe you're referring to the proposal that was floated to have a 50-year mortgage. And when I first saw that, I was like shocked at first, and then I laughed, and then I said, "Wow, it is really the exact opposite of everything we've just been talking about right now." If you had a 50-year mortgage, you would see probably a very significant increase in prices because people are now going to be able to have a lower monthly payment for a more expensive house. I think that's the opposite of the direction that we want to go in. There are certain people out there who would love to have that. You know, if you're a mortgage lender, that might not be a bad thing because you're going to get even more in interest payments over the course of that 50 years. What happens if the person passes away over the course of the 50-year mortgage? I think there's lots of reasons why that's not a very good idea, but thankfully it appears that it did not go anywhere. It was floated, and then you didn't hear much about it since
Mm-mm.
then. I haven't heard any of the policymakers mentioning that. So it appears that it was floated. The reaction was horrible. I mean, it was just, thankfully, there's a huge backlash against it. So it didn't go anywhere. But yeah, that's definitely not something we want to do.
I agree. I didn't see it as a benefit other than you get a lower payment, but I definitely saw the connection of the dry. I right away made the analogy to the cars. I was like,
Right.
those car loans just keep getting longer and longer, and the price keeps going up and up. I mean, do we not see the problem here?
Right.
Overall, looking ahead, what happens if the current housing trends continue unchanged over the next decade?
Well, it's interesting you asked the previous question because um, a lot of times the policymakers want easy solutions that won't work, but they sound good. And so this 50-year mortgage thing, hopefully that's not a zombie that rises from the dead again and tries to come back and haunt us. I think you will see people that will try to call for that as a solution if prices keep going up and up. You will see people calling for more spending. There will always be the industry and the industrial complex, if you will. Just like there's the defense industrial complex, there's also one here in housing and construction as well. They're going to want more money for this, more money for that, more money for this program, more money for that program. One thing we do know for sure is when we look back over the years and the decades, just throwing more money at it doesn't work. That hasn't caused prices to be more affordable. The more the government's spending, the more things have gotten more expensive. But a lot of people are not aware of that. They think that if you spend money, that's how you fix the problem. So I think you will see calls to try to increase spending on various programs that have not been proven to work. I think you will see an increasing desire of the federal government to look at local zoning and building codes.
Mhm.
They're going to say, if you and your local community don't change your building codes to build more housing, we're going to withhold this grant, withhold that grant to give you less money. And that's people have different opinions on that. But what about federalism? What about the ability of a local community to decide if it wants to do housing? If you live in a neighborhood where people have 2 or 3 acres, do you want to have to build an apartment complex there? Or have you all decided that you don't want that? I mean, shouldn't the local community be able to have say over what it does and what kind of housing comes in and when it comes in? So I think we've got to be very careful with the federal government deciding that it wants to go into local communities and try to say, build more housing here, build more housing there, build more housing there, when in fact the local people are the ones who have to live there every day. And so maybe they should be the ones who have the say in how much new housing they want to bring online and at what degree they want to bring it on. So I do think that you will see the federal government try to jump in and try to be the arbiter in these local zoning and decisions and building codes. So I think that's one trend you'll see. Now, those are all things that I see as maybe a little bit troubling. If we can get some momentum, or if the American people can have a conversation and say, let's look at housing finance. Let's look at all the things that the government does to make housing more expensive, such as having 80% of mortgages backed by the federal governments. Maybe we have a conversation about how we can reform that so that the market has a more of a say in the picture instead of the government always having its foot on the throttle. I think that's how you make real change over time. And there are some conversations continuing about housing finance, but it's something that requires always a lot of pressure is one way of saying it, but a lot of attention, because it's easy for the politicians to ignore it and just focus on things that sound good, like throwing more money at it or creating a new program, or we're going to get these states to build more housing. We're going to get them to build more. Okay, but don't they have a right to have a say in it? So I think those are the kind of things that you'll see going forward.
I think it's a two-pronged approach at the federal level, focused on how do you reform the financing piece of it, and how FHA and Sally Mae and Freddie Mae and the secondary markets. But the other part is um, it is the local markets, and I do have these conversations with people a lot, and it does come down to the local zoning and permitting, and how those processes work. And I'm sure there are some communities that it works great, but maybe the way the federal government can play a role there is by creating a model, a suggested model that communities can build off of, and then allow their local residents to have input on what works for them, and kind of begin a model, not a forced top down approach, because that's what the federal government likes to do, the one size fits all, but a suggested model that each community could look at and then manipulate for what works for their certain circumstances. Like you said, larger communities that have larger pieces of property, they don't want an apartment complex there, obviously. But you got to start somewhere, and somebody has to sort of create a model to work from. And, there are organizations out there that I think could create that, and then work across the country with local communities. But we do have to start figuring out how to move the process along at the local level through the permitting system. And I don't want the federal government doing it, because we'll end up with we'll end up with terrible tract housing, or apartment complexes sitting on 2-acre farms or whatever. I mean, it'll be terrible, but something that we can build off of at the local level would be great if the government could do that.
Yeah, that's very interesting you mentioned that, because I believe that the 21st century road to housing legislation that Congress is looking at does have a provision in there for HUD, where I used to work, to develop some type of toolkit that communities could use in order to check out different types of housing options. It's very interesting. President Herbert Hoover in 1933 issued a report on housing. This big, massive report is very, very good. And there's a whole section in there on blueprints for housing. It says, if you got people that make this much money, build these blueprints. If you got people that live in this kind of neighborhood, build this blueprint. It was very well done. It kind of lays out different models that communities could use. So, yeah, I think something like that and something like what you're talking about is good. And there are a few organizations out there looking at those kind of things right now, but HUD has been called out in this legislation to develop a type of playbook like that. So I think you will see more of those resources pop up. I think where, the rubber meets the road is what will it take for the communities to adopt that? And how will you deal with what they call NIMBYism, where people, don't want more density or more housing near them, maybe for legitimate reasons, maybe not. But if they don't want that, then what do you do? I think those are the questions. But I do think getting those resources out there, as you said, is a very good idea. It's good for people to see what the options are.
Absolutely. Last question. Tell
Mhm.
everyone where they can learn more about you and read more of what you're working on.
Sure. So on Twitter, Vote John Gibbs. That's my Twitter handle. You can also go to the Heritage website, and my articles that I do will be on there. I will be publishing quite a few things going forward. We'll be doing some events on housing here at Heritage, so stay tuned for that. So the Heritage website is a good place to hang out, as well as on my Twitter, Vote John Gibbs. So yeah, that's what people can check out.
Well, thanks, John, so much for joining us and helping us unpack one of the biggest economic challenges facing American families today. And thank you for listening to Main Street Matters. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon with another episode.